Now that you know the style of your wedding film, let's nerd out on the tech for a bit. For a typical wedding day, my gear consists of a Panasonic GH4, Sony a7R II, Metabones adapters, Sigma 18 to 35mm f1.8, Canon 16 to 35mm 2.8, Canon 70 to 200 f2.8 IS, Zeiss 50mm 1.4, Canon 85mm 1.8, ND filters, Tiffin black satin filter, glide cam, and a monopod. That's a lot of stuff, you might think, but for most of the day, I'm actually just on the GH4 with my Sigma 18 to 35mm on it. This is a great combination. I used to shoot with a Canon 5D, and then I switched over the GH4 and then later added on the Sony for its amazing image and low light capabilities. I'm sure I'll change cameras within the next couple of years, and you might be shooting on a different camera, but all the same principles apply. So why did I choose these cameras? Well, the GH4 is a really great camera for weddings. It's small, light, it's cheap, it has a great battery life, and it has a really nice 4K image. The Sony a7R II is also a really nice camera, especially in low light conditions. I love shooting with this camera during the reception when usually the light is very limited, and the camera does great. It is a little bit expensive, especially if you go with the Metabones adapter, but it's a great camera to have. It's also really important to have two camera bodies. In the beginning, I used to only shoot with one camera body, and this is really sketchy because if something happens to that one camera body, you're pretty screwed. So if you have two camera bodies and something happens to one of them, you're okay. You can just keep using the other camera for the rest of the shoot. As I mentioned, I like to use the Metabones Speed Booster adapters. This allows me to use all my Canon lenses on both the Panasonic GH4 and the Sony a7R II. And this way I also don't have to carry around two different sets of lenses, one for the Panasonic and one for the Sony. It's really convenient for wedding films. The Metabones adapters are a bit more pricey, but definitely worth every penny. Now let's look at how to make sure you get the most cinematic image out of your camera. First and foremost, make sure you're filming in 24 frames per second. This is the most cinematic frame rate that you can shoot on. You can shoot in higher frame rates, but make sure then in post you're putting it back to 24 frames per second. Virtually all Hollywood movies are filmed in 24 frames per second, and this really gives it this cinematic look that we're all used to. So this is a must. You gotta film in 24 frames per second. I shoot both cameras in 4K so I can recrop or stabilize the footage in post. And also both cameras just do much better in 4K versus 1080. For the Sony, I like to shoot in the S-Log2 picture profile, and the GH4 I choose the Cine D picture profile. This provides me the most room in post to grade later on, where the footage really comes alive. I also like to set the GH4 sharpness to -5. I find the GH4 is just too sharp, and it really gives this video-ish vibe, instead of the filmic cinematic quality that we're looking for. Shutter speed is really the amount of motion blur that's in each frame. The lower the number, the more blur there'll be. And if you put it to a higher number, there'll be less motion blur. Typically, you'll keep your shutter speed at double whatever the frame rate you're shooting in, which is usually 48 or 50 if your camera can't do 48. There are exceptions. You could go for a more dreamlike look and use a slower shutter speed, or if you want a more chaotic or intense look, you could use a higher shutter speed. But typically keep it at 48. It's good to know also that as you change the shutter speed, your exposure will change. But this really isn't a good way of changing exposure, as you're changing the look of the image as you change it. Aperture changes the depth of field, or the amount that's in focus. A lower aperture or a smaller number will give you a shallow depth of field, whereas a higher aperture or a larger number will give you a deep depth of field. Typically you want to shoot at a lower aperture. This gives you a nice cinematic depth of field, and it also really highlights whatever you're focusing on, separating it from the background or the foreground. But there are exceptions to that also. Sometimes you need whatever's in foreground and background to be in focus, and this is when you would use a deep depth of field or a higher number aperture. A lower aperture will also help a lot when you don't have much available light. That's why it's really important to have lenses that are at least f2.8 or faster if you can. Definitely try to shoot at lower apertures so you get that beautiful bokeh and keep that cinematic style. ISO simply changes the sensitivity of your sensor, or basically makes it brighter or darker. The downside is the higher the ISO, the more noise you'll introduce. So test your camera and see where the limits are, but usually you want to keep the ISO as low as possible. There are definitely times you're gonna bump the ISO, but try to keep it as low as possible, or at least within the limits of your camera. Every camera has a different threshold where the ISO is just too high, too noisy, and it just doesn't look good anymore. This is really important to making cinematic images. Make sure you also keep your eye on the white balance. White balance is something that often gets forgotten, and it can really mess you up in post. If it's daylight, choose the daylight setting or 5500 Kelvin. If it's tungsten lighting, which usually indoor lighting is, use the tungsten setting or 3200 Kelvin. If you can't control the light and you have both tungsten and daylight, try to split the difference and select 4300 Kelvin. Auto white balance can also work, but it can make your post process a little bit more tedious if it keeps changing the white balance by a little bit all the time. If you choose one setting, that way one scene will all stay the same looking. I sometimes use the auto white balance setting when I'm filming in the reception during, let's say, the dance or somewhere where the light's changing often and I can't be changing the white balance all the time. Another key piece of equipment are ND filters. Make sure you use ND filters, especially when you're shooting outside, so you can keep that cinematic shallow depth of field without having to break the 180 rule on your shutter speed. I like to use variable ND filters because they allow you to change the amount of ND that's being applied really quickly and easily just by spinning the lens filter. This is a must for documentary type shooting like weddings, especially if your cameras don't have built-in ND filters. I also like to use a filter called the Tiffin Black Satin filter. This is another little bit of my secret sauce for how to make my images really cinematic. It just keeps the image a little bit more organic, softens up the midtones like skin tones a little bit more while still keeping the sharpness and detail. It also helps to blend the highlights a little bit, especially when things are blowing out. When you're looking to buy a filter for your lens, make sure you buy a larger size, like a 77mm thread filter, so you can use it on all your lenses. Just buy a large size and then use step-up rings for each specific lens. The step-up rings cost very little, so it will save you a lot of money rather than buying 3 or 5 sizes of the same filter. The lenses I really like to use are the Sigma 18-35mm on my GH4 and the Canon 16-35 on my Sony. I like to use lenses that are really fast. These are typically lenses that are f2.8 or lower. This allows you to get that nice shallow depth of field. I shoot 95% of the day either on the Sigma 18-35mm 1.8 or the Canon 16-35mm 2.8. because it allows me to get those wide shots when I need it, but also go in for the close-ups. I also like to use the Canon 70-200 f2.8 IS, especially because of the image stabilization. This really helps when I'm on the monopod and I'm trying to get those close-ups in the church or during the reception for the speeches. The other lenses I carry are more just for backup, or in the case of really low light situations. Lenses like the Zeiss 50mm 1.4 are really great for when there just isn't enough light. Let's look at stabilizers. It's really important to use stabilization. Nothing takes you out of the story faster than shaky footage that you can barely see what's going on. I like to stay light with my gear, so I only take along a monopod and a Steadicam. I have the same Manfrotto base plate on both the monopod and the Steadicam, so I can quickly switch from one to the other. Sometimes I'll also set up one camera on the Steadicam so it's ready to use right when I need it. Invest in a good monopod like the Manfrotto monopod, and make sure it has the feet sticking out of the bottom for extra stability. A monopod is really great because it allows you to get tons of shots really quickly and you barely have to adjust anything. Whereas a tripod will take you a lot longer to set up and move around, and it's clunky and big and heavy. A monopod is a must for wedding films. It's really a great tool and I can't stress that enough. For the Steadicam, I have a GlideCam 2000, which is a great way to add movement and excitement to your films. You could also use an electronic gimbal, but I like the idea of a Steadicam because it just always works. You don't have to worry about it breaking down on you in the middle of a shoot. Balancing a Steadicam can be a little bit tricky, so make sure you go through it even the night before so it's pretty much set up already the way you're going to use it the next day. The way I balance my GlideCam is first put on the camera with the lens that you want, and make sure to take off the lens cap as this will affect the balance. Then take the GlideCam and put it horizontal. Let it go and see how long it takes to get to vertical. It should take about 2 seconds. If it's a lot faster or slower, adjust the height of the bar. Then put it on a table or anything flat and pick it up. See which way it's tilting. Then simply adjust the camera on the plate to the opposite direction of where it was tilting. Keep doing this process over and over again till it's balanced. Once you can pick up the GlideCam and move it side to side without it tipping, then you know you're balanced. Try and shoot with a nice wide angle lens on the Steadicam. I like to use the Sigma 18-35mm or the Canon 16-35mm. This also helps you to get those wide sweeping shots and then also get tighter and do small movements. The most basic Steadicam move I find is to just circle around your subject, keeping the same distance so you keep your focus. This is a really nice way to add some movement and excitement to the shots. It's a great way to cover details or group shots, or any other subject really. Another move I like to do with the Steadicam is to get focus on the subject, then step back a few meters, and then walk forwards to that same position. This way you get a nice sweeping motion towards the subject and you end up with perfect focus. Following a couple walking and talking can also be a great way to get cinematic footage really easily and quickly. Just ask the couple to walk and talk about anything they want. The key is for them to look really natural for this to work well. So that's my gear.